Thank you for joining today. If you are new to my stream, or particularly the stream today, we are picking up from a project we started last week, and it is building an Eleventy based RSS reader. So we're kind of looking at how can we build an app using the Jamstack, and for myself, Eleventy is my tool of choice. It's a static site generator, but it's given us some ways that we can hook into data and accomplish the other things that we want when we look at the essence of what's involved to make an RSS reader app. So I'm going to switch my view here so we can do a quick review of what we accomplished last stream. And so here we have our repo for this project, which I'll pop into the chat. This is a base Eleventy site. And so far what we've done is we last week started getting our templating in place. We haven't done any styling. We've only done the essential things we need for the semantics of this. We're going to improve that as part of what we're working on today. But let's just go to our commit real quick. That'll help us kind of review what we did. The biggest thing that we accomplished was updating how we're getting data from RSS feeds. And for that, we're using the feed parser package. And this is a node package, and what it offers to us is that we can pass it in a feed and it will do the parsing. And it doesn't matter if it's an Atom feed or an RSS feed or even a podcast based feed. We've validated that it works for those environments. So what we did last stream is we created a function so that we could go through and loop through some of our data sources, which we parsed out into their own individual JSON files. And let me see if I can get to that really quick. So for each of our categories of feeds, we created a JSON file. And so you can see I have here the CSS category, and then just an items array that holds each of the direct links out to the feeds for that source. And so what this function is doing for us is it is globbing those together and creating an array out of them. And then what happens at that point is that array gets parsed through, and we do some transforms on that return data for each item in that array so that we customize what data we get back, and then we're able to use that in our templating. So that's the main thing we focused on. I'm just scrolling through in our last stream. The other big thing with that is once we've had the data available to us, which I definitely encourage you to go back and look at that stream. There was a lot of information that we packed into that. But the other big thing we talked about was pagination. And the TLDR on that is pagination is the way that we can dynamically create pages using Eleventy from any data source. So once we had our feed data source ready in that other function, we were able to use pagination to dynamically create, as in this example, category pages. And you can see that when we have that data returned to us, we're also able to populate what shows up on that page. So, for example, for our category pages, we looped through and showed the individual feeds that were in that category. We had to get a little more complex when it got down to both the individual items pages and also the source pages. So let's go to my source one first. We had to update how we were doing our pagination. We had to switch it to a JavaScript style. And the reason for that is so we could use the Eleventy before function. And this allowed us to modify that feed source, which was a multi-dimensional array holding every category, every source within the category, and then all of the returned feed items within that source. We needed to drill down to the correct level for that set of dynamic pages. So using this before function, we were able to drill down into that feed source, and in this case, return the second level. So this is going to output the individual items for a particular source. So for example, my own site, moderncss.dev, this would output the returned RSS items just for moderncss.dev. And so that allowed us to, all those things I just recapped, that allowed us to use this idea of creating a JSON file per category of feed to create a scalable, maintainable, and much better organized solution than when we originally started and had this array information hard-coded into our feed source. So all of that, again, was in the name of organization and scaling this. So that's what we accomplished last time. I know this GitHub view is a little hard to see, but I just wanted to make sure we did a little recap of where we're at in this project. Okay, so what we accomplished then was just outputting each of those views. So I'm on my home page right now. And so we accomplished creating views for example, the category page. So now we're drilled down to just CSS. And then also something like word wrap. So one of my individual sources. So we also gave a look over our wireframes, and this is what we're kind of going to focus more in on today. We're still not going to style them, but we're going to update the data output in each of our views. And critically, we're going to figure out how to determine whether something's a new content. And I did some pre-work on this because I was really going back and forth on what does that mean? How can we make this scalable? How can we make this work both for a local environment, but also if you choose to push this up to a production site so that anybody can visit what you have for RSS feeds. Just a recap of our wireframes. So we saw that we created the base views. And so our goal today is to kind of format these and, like I said, most importantly, somehow devise a way to determine new content, because I think that's a very critical feature of an RSS feed, is helping you identify what's new, what you might not have read yet. And so one other quick thing though, okay, so I have my project open here. I've already got it running. One other quick thing that I missed discussing last time is when we were creating our views, and let me get into on our index page where we are, for each item, we are pulling out the date. Now, this date has already been somewhat pre-formatted because of what's required for an RSS feed. And so it's formatted as what's called an ISO date. And so what we're doing is we're piping it through a custom filter called postDate, and that allows it to, what we've done in our filter is kind of made it a more readable, friendly format of that date. And this is definitely something that if you choose to pick up the starter that we create at the end of this project, you can certainly continue customizing it. But where that's located, and we're going to create another filter today, is in our Eleventy config file. So you can see we've created this filter called postDate. Eleventy also ships with a date library called Luxon, which is kind of a subset of Moment, to my understanding. And so we're just going to pull that in. We're just going to keep using that. It's lighter weight, is my understanding. And so we're using their datetime function to convert from that original format that's provided in the RSS feed. And then we're using this handy function called toLocaleString. And that's how we're getting this updated date format. So that's being done by a filter against the original RSS feed item. We're going to create another filter today, so we'll talk about how that works a little bit more. Our biggest challenge is determining this idea of what is new. And when we originally did the first stream about thinking, what does our feature list look like for this? Someone mentioned the idea of last access, and I've kind of picked up on that as a term. I think it was a good one to describe that time in between when you were looking at your feed's worth of items and then your return, right? So that time period in between, you're viewing it from a last accessed date. And that helps us to have a date to compare against to decide what is new content, because new is going to be individual to us as the reader, right? So I went through a couple different iterations of this. Like, what does that last date mean? Do we need to save a date somewhere? How does that look like on a local build versus pushing it up to a production build? Because remember, we're dealing with a static site, so there's not a database behind this. If there was, we would definitely have a different way of approaching this. I have a personal history with WordPress, so I'd probably just save that into the WordPress database and we'd just be able to query against it, and no big deal. Some hosts are starting to provide Netlify in particular is starting to provide things like on-demand builders. So these things where you can fetch and rebuild processes even for static sites, which is a pretty awesome idea and would work really well for our site. So you could take what we're going to do today and convert it a little bit if you would like that solution. Now, again, that's in consideration of if you're going to push this up to host somewhere. When we very first started this project, we mentioned one of the benefits of doing this is that we're not creating a UI to manage our feeds. We're creating our RSS app via configuration. So that's why we're hosting all of our categories and feed URLs in JSON files. Since we don't have a database, we're using that method to configure. How do we get that date then? How do we save that out? Well, again, I went back and forth on this, and we're going to go through what I landed on, and I'm really interested in your feedback of if this makes sense and, what other alternatives you have. Again, keeping in mind that definitely you could move this to a serverless function. You could still hook it up to a database service of your choice and kind of handle it that way. But how can we do it when we're talking about just local files or maybe a periodic build, like a nightly build against a production site? What I kind of landed on is that since we already have some build processes in place, we have our start command, which is what we're running right now, and that's going to include Eleventy with browser sync and a local server. And so we need some way to define a date in that initial build, but we also need some way for the scenario of, a production build or one that's done on a web server. And so a handy feature that we already have in use right now is this idea of a post build. And so what that means is that this is a convention through the way NPM and Node works, is that when you define a script, you can also define a pre, which would have run before, and a post script. And you just simply add pre or post to the base command name. So in this case, we already had it set up. We mentioned in the very first stream that we extended this original Eleventy project from my template for Sass. So we've already got this set up, and what it's currently doing is it's doing a post build to minify and auto prefix our CSS. So we're going to kind of co-opt that idea of running something post build to save a date that we can use the next time a build happens. Now, the reason I've landed on a post build idea is that way, if say the nightly build runs tonight, right? It's going to save today's date. And then it's going to use today's date for tomorrow's build. So that way you have the time frame of essentially one day if we were, like I said, running a nightly function. So that way you can see, is there any new items in that day span? And so whatever your build, time between is, if you choose not to do a nightly build but a weekly build, then it would be a week, right? But we need a way for this to also work locally. And for that, we're going to talk about using environment variables so that we can kind of fake that day previous. I experimented with doing a post start, and it wasn't quite working the way that, super made sense. So anyway, we'll work through that. That's our kind of challenge here. So the first thing we need to do before we, have it run a function is create that function. And I'm kind of inventing a pattern for this. It's not something I do very often, write my own Node script, which is what we're going to do. But it can be useful in certain circumstances like this, which is which we are going to be writing a date to a file. That's how we're going to save it, since we don't have a database and we're not getting into serverless functions right now. So I'm going to create the directory of app just to signify, it's additional scripts related to my application. And then I'm going to create the file lastaccessed.js. And this is going to contain a Node script. Now, we're going to keep it pretty simple. Again, I don't write Node every day. But what we're going to do is set it up to write the date to a file. And I'm working on copying and pasting this over a little bit. The first thing we have to do is we have to require this, I think it's a native thing to Node dealing with the file system, and it's what we use to write a file. And then we're going to create a variable that's going to essentially, it's always going to be the current date, right? That's what we're going to compare against or write against. And then we're going to convert it to specifically just get the time value, because that's going to give us a number rather than a pre-formatted date or some, so that we can do a math comparison against it. And then once we have that value available, we are going to write it out, and we're going to write it specifically into our Eleventy data file. And as we looked at last stream, that's going to allow us to pick that up anywhere in our template, which will be really handy. And so since we're completely writing this file does not exist right now, right? We're completely writing it. We're going to ensure that that gets created as a module. And that's just so that we can access it a few different ways, both in templates and also like requiring its value, which we're going to see in use in a minute. Cool. So right now, that file just exists. It's not being called to do anything. I'm going to quit my currently running watch process. And what we're going to do is jump back to the package, and we're going to update our post build function. The first thing we have to do is move what's currently in there into its own function so that we can still access it. And instead, we're going to I've already got npm run all here, which helps us ensure a cross-environment way that we can run multiple scripts within one command. So we're going to use npm run all because we want to be able to run in parallel. So in other words, they can run simultaneously. And we're going to run the CSS function that was previously the only thing running post build, but also our new last access, which we need to create. So what that looks like to create a script that runs a node function is we use node to just simply call that file. And so pretty handy, pretty useful little trick. I learned this myself just a few months ago. But when you need to do things like write to files or kind of do some additional data processing that's not handled in Eleventy or whatever tool you're using, this is really handy. So what we've essentially said is after the build completes its run, then it's going to both run our CSS function. Again, I said that was to minify an auto prefix, and also our last accessed function. So let's go ahead. So instead of running our start, we're going to run our build command. And we'll see in the output when that happens. And hopefully I copy pasted correctly and we don't have an error. Okay, so we see that it ran here at the very end. Oh, test not found. Did I? Oh, it would help to spell it correctly. Try again. Okay, and if you, the stream may not picked it up fast enough, but it created this file from scratch. So there we go. So anytime we run our build function, it's going to, at the end of that build, add this updated date. Cool, so that covers us from a build perspective. But if we're doing local development, or you've seeded this starter, we need something to go by at that point. And the current date isn't going to really help us because we would never ever see new items, right? There wouldn't be anything probably published in that millisecond between running start and getting this data. I'm going to delete this since it's our dynamic file so that we can make sure it gets recreated when we make additional updates. So we need to know, I mentioned that the post start script wasn't quite working. If it was, we could essentially do the same idea, but we still need something initial value either way. Well, in considering, how we're going to use this, if you were using it as a local thing, considering that we are configuring this to kind of our tastes, or how we're, want to approach and read our content, what we're going to do is bring in the idea of environment variables. And based on whether we detect in our last access script that this is being run on development or in production, we can adjust this date. So the first thing we need to do is we need to install a couple more packages. We're going to install the cross environment package and also the dot environment package. We'll talk about what those do for us. So the cross environment package just makes sure that whether you're on, for example, Mac or PC, you will not have issues accessing these environment variables. Because what we're going to do is we're going to, within our post build script at the very beginning, we're going to define our own environment variable, Eleventy env, you can call it whatever you would like. And so for our build environment, we're going to say it's production. And then we are going to go ahead and create a pre-start. So one that would run prior to our Eleventy start function. And we're going to call that environment dev. And that's when we're going to run the last access. So as is, it's going to get the current date. We mentioned that's not super useful. We'll never see new items. So what we're going to do is adjust our last access script. The first thing we need to do is make sure we have access to those new environment variables. And that's what this .env, it's kind of the standard, I guess, might be the correct term, for how to access these environment variables that we added. So we want to make sure we have access to those in this file. And what we're going to do is make a modification in between here. And if we are in our dev environment, we are going to subtract 1 day. So in other words, we at least get a day's worth of new items in our check. So let's just make sure that that's going to run. Now, again, I deleted my last access so we can make sure that this works as our pre-start function. Oh, and I did miss something. Let's see, env is not in, oh, I forgot to pull that out. Okay, so we added access to it, but the part that I just missed was creating a variable to check that particular environment variable. So again, this name matches what we called it in our pre-start and post-build scripts. So a little misstep there. Let's try again. Running our start script. So it should be in development mode, and we can see that happening right here. And we can see that it is running as the very first thing before the Eleventy build starts. And the Eleventy build still went, reprocessed all of our content. And because it was ahead of that build, it's going to change what date is used to check against for our feeds. And that's the part we haven't done yet. So we need to do that next. But we validated that it worked. And so what we can do is we can console log this out so we can double check that that date really is the day before. I have to restart here. So we'll bump up here. So here's the date that it's doing. Since we're in development, it's subtracting a day, so it's pulling up, might be kind of hard to see, it's pulling up 6/10, so yesterday. So we validated that that date works. Now I'm going to go ahead before we actually continue, and we know that 1 day for our particular feed sources is not going to get us new content. We want to make sure we can see that new number so that we can complete the other steps that require us to have some new content. So I'm going to set this back 30 days just for our initial development. And then we will reset it back to 1 before we push it up to the repo today. So what we've just done here is definitely outside of Eleventy, right? This is can be done on any project that uses Node or any other static site generator. It's in addition to. And we mentioned it's really just because we don't have a local database. We need some way to save this kind of date information. So writing it to a file is what I came up with. Is it the best? I don't know. I'm open to feedback. Again, since I don't do this kind of thing every day, it's what sprung to mind and seems pretty maintainable, seems to give us the data at the right time. But we'll see. All right, so we have that data available, but now we actually have to use it. So we're going to go back into the data file that is compiling all of our feed sources together. And we need to adjust this so that we can check against that last access date to determine what is new content. Now, the other key of why this is going to work for us is that this is only going to be requested at build time. And so, it's not going to be a dynamic date. It's only going to be requested the one time, or created the one time. So first we're going to, because we're in a data file and not a template file, we have to require that information. A data file in Eleventy can't, template out other data. If we were inside of our index, we could use this method to essentially just use the word less access and we would get it returned that way. Okay, so we have it available to us. And I got to get scrolled down here. What we're going to do is within the loop that is covering getting each item and developing the unique array of that particular item's information, we're going to add a new variable that is, I'm going to call item timestamp. So it's going to create that actual timestamp based on the date of that unique RSS item. And so now that we have that available, we can add whether or not this item is new. And so what we're going to do is do a simple check against the item timestamp in the last accessed. And so if the timestamp of the individual item is greater than our last access date, that is how we're going to determine that that is a new item. So now we can go into we'll start with our index file. And we'll do just a quick check here for each individual feed item. And if you missed our earlier streams, we are using Nunjux as our primary templating language. So that's where this syntax is coming from. And so we're going to use an if check to see is this item new, because we created this as a Boolean in here. Or really just simply does it have a value is really what this is checking. And if so, we're just, for now, outputting the string of new. All right, so let's start this and double check that that is working. I go back to our home page here. Do a quick refresh. All right, so we don't have any new items in the top one because we're only looking at the past month here. And so this one's way too far out. This one's outside the date range. But clear down here at our word wrap, we have 2 that are in our date range, and they are in fact showing the new string. So that's good. That's an improvement. But the other nice thing that we wanted to have for, in particular, the homepage view and the individual category view, really across all our views, we'd like to surface that total number of new items. That's what this is intended to represent. And so the way we're going to accomplish this is to add another Eleventy filter. So if you missed the top of the stream today, Eleventy filters are, we looked at the postDate one we had added in the previous stream. But a filter will allow you to pass in some type of data. So in this case, it was a string. For the one we're going to create, we're going to pass in an array. And then essentially you just modify the string or the array and return it in whatever filtered way you would like to do. So we want to filter the array of feed items to determine how many are new. So essentially we want to return items that have the new identifier. So we're going to call this filter new count. And so we'll just set it up. And so you're kind of responsible for knowing, what type of data this is to treat it accordingly. So we're not going to do any checks today. You could certainly add in checks to make sure it's an array and that sort of thing. But what we're going to do is return our feed items, and we're going to filter those so that we can just say, is item new? All right, so we've passed in the feed items, we're filtering through them. And this is maybe a little misleading because at this point, we're still returning the array. It's just been filtered down. But what we're going to do in order to get the number out of that is we're going to set that number into a variable. So using nunjucks, this is the one bit of syntax in nunjucks that's a little bit more messy, a little bit hard to parse sometimes, but they use the set keyword here, and then this is our variable name. So we're setting a new variable of new count. And so we're passing in our feed items array into our new count filter that we just created. So that's going to return only the new items. And then we're piping it through the nunjucks filter of length. So now we're converting from that to a number by checking the length of it. And then following setting of that variable, we can just do a quick double check to make sure that's greater than 0, and then we will output it. So I'm letting that rebuild, and hopefully, yes. So let me zoom in a little bit. So it has worked. So here's our 2. And then meanwhile, the other ones that don't have new items have not displayed an updated number there. So we did a check within our feed items against our last access date to determine whether the item was new. And then we created a filter to actually surface the length of new items within that particular source. And so we have made it particular to an individual source. We could, raise this up and we could check it across the entire category. So that could be a stretch challenge if you'd like to approach that. Okay, so we've figured out how to get a last access date. We figured out how to mark our items as new and set up a variable within nunjucks, and then added that count to our template. The next thing we'd like to do, though, is the last access date and the new idea is great, but we're still getting way too many items overall returned, right? We're getting the entire history of RSS items that are available in that feed. And that's too much, right? That's not really the purpose of an RSS reader. There should be some sort of time constraints, at least in my opinion. So let's figure out how to constrain this by time. So how we're going to approach that is within our feeds file that's, going over what is returned in that RSS feed and creating that. Again, right now it's getting absolutely everything. So we're going to use some of the ideas that we already sort of learned about with creating a date and modifying that date to be able to check against. So at the top of our file, so that it is a consistent number throughout our usage of it, we're going to do something very similar to what we did in the last access file. We're going to get the current date, and this time we're going to subtract 90 days, so 3-ish months. And you can certainly modify this to what works for you. Again, you're configuring how best to make this application work for you. So maybe you do just go 1 day, maybe you go 10 days, really whatever works. And then, as we've discussed multiple times, we're converting that to a timestamp so we can do a math comparison. All right, so now that we have that timestamp, we'll go back down to where we're iterating over the items. And we've also created this variable to hold the current item's timestamp. So we've got the two pieces of information that we need. So we'll just adjust this loop to say that if the current item is less than, in this case, our date limit, we'll just return. So in other words, stop processing this item, don't add it to our array. Now, we're going to get an error here. And the reason is that that iteration through our feed items is being done in within this parse feed function. And what we're currently doing is we're assuming that content's returned, and that's what's causing the error. So we need to just throw a check around this to make sure that we actually get a feedback. So in other words, that error is coming up because if a feed source has no items in the last 90 days, then there's not a first item because there's nothing there at all. So we're just going to add a simple check for length of that returned array that's coming back from parsing of that feed. And this is the one time with Eleventy, or one of the very few times, that you actually have to restart the feed when you get the build when you get an error, is when you get kind of a severe error here. So I'm just going to close that out and we'll restart. And hope I didn't miss a step. All right, we didn't get an error. I'm going to have to refresh this. You're going to see a drastic reduction in the feed items. So now we're only getting feed items in the last 90 days. And that's really helped scope down, what's being built and generated here. So that's kind of our, to me, the really essential features that we needed to help kind of control the content that's being returned is to compare it to determine what's new, and then also just generally scope down what even content should be available in the reader. So what we haven't quite done, and we have a few minutes left to do, is we've just given ourselves the most essential items here to validate our views. We haven't actually, this doesn't link anywhere. And we have a few different things that we want to link together. So let's at least link between our category, our individual sources, and then finally the full article view, because we are hosting those locally. That is part of the views being created. And again, you can find out how that's working in the previous stream that will also be included when this is edited for YouTube. So we're just going to add these links and then we'll probably call it good for today. So this view right here is our home page. So we're going to need to open up our index. And then we're just, going to add some links in here. But these are going to be based on the permalink structure that we created when we paginated each of our views. So we can do a quick review of that. The top level one, the first one that we're going to want to link to is this category. That's what these titles are representing. And so it's going to be category as a permanent base. That's what we decided on. And then the name of the category. And what we were doing is we're using a built-in filter called slug, and that's going to lowercase things, change spaces to dashes, that kind of thing. Make it permalink friendly. So we can actually copy this. And when we go to add our link here, let's make sure we have both sides of this before I continue. Within our, href, we're going to give it the category, and the one change we're going to make is we have a different local variable. I don't know, we could change it either way. I might actually change this one to be categories. I don't know. I always confuse myself or change my mind on pluralizing in which way. I think I'll keep it singular because it makes more sense singular down here. And I guess we have it done here too. So we're getting that title again, and we're slugifying it. So that way we make sure it matches what we've created as that link, which hopefully it will. We'll double check that right now. So I'm going to choose Eleventy this time. And all right, good, success. And remember that view is being dynamically created through pagination. which is super handy. We're not having to manually create the individual category pages, which makes our solution really scalable. We looked at this at the top of the stream within GitHub, but what we had done is we'd created a unique JSON file for each of our categories. And then we're globbing those together in feeds. In case you missed that part and you're wondering how are we even like outputting this content to begin with or where it's coming from. I'm going to continue doing this idea that we just showed of how we're fetching the name and we're slugifying it. I'm going to go ahead and finish those couple more areas of linking together the source and the individual items. And then this will be available. The updates that we made today, they will be available on GitHub in our RSS Reader app. And I will be back next week and we will focus on completing the templating and also getting into the styling. So I hope you learned some new things about filters and kind of some extra new things about writing new files and maybe expanded how you consider architecting these types of applications. And I'm open to feedback. And if you agree with my solutions on that, thanks again.